meet in center block. So this is a change not just for senators and staff who are coming this morning, but also for staff of the center who are not used to this many people coming quite so early in the morning. So a special welcome to all of you. And this is our first Open Caucus for 2019. And today we'll be focusing on what we think is a very long overdue subject, and that's the opioid crisis in Canada. I'm Jane Cordy. I'm a senator from Nova Scotia, and beside me is Senator Gagné, who is from Manitoba. And along with Senator Bellemare, we are the co-chairs of the Open Caucus, which we try to hold at least once a month. I'd like to take this time to thank Andrew Miller, who's standing at the back. Most of you probably met him. He's pretty precise. He told me this morning that I could start the meeting in exactly 1 minute. So he's definitely a detailed guy, and this is his first Open Caucus that he's organized, and he's done a great job. So thank you very much, Andrew. The Open Caucus, as you know, is a forum that we have for discussing issues of national importance. And this meeting is co-sponsored by the Independent Senators Group, also known as the ISG, the Independent Senate Liberals, and the Government Representative Office in the Senate. And this is a nonpartisan caucus, and it's great to have it. It's open to all parliamentarians. All of our Senate colleagues are invited, and MPs are also invited, staff, media, and the public. On a per capita basis, we know that Canada remains the second highest user of opioids in the world. In Canada, there has been a rapid increase in overdoses and deaths caused by opioids, especially from highly concentrated forms such as fentanyl. Between January 2016 and June 2018, more than 9,000 people have lost their lives in Canada due to the opioid-related causes, with an average of 11 deaths a day. That's astounding. Those statistics are astounding. 11 deaths a day in 2017. British Columbia and Ontario remain the two leading provinces with the highest rates of opioid-related harms and deaths. Research suggests that the use and misuse of opioids is a complex health and social issue that requires further investigation, and that's part of what we're doing this morning. This morning, we have the great honor of convening a panel of experts who will provide us with significant insights into both the systemic and individual factors that have led Canada to become the second largest consumer of opioids in the world. This is a great opportunity for the senators sitting around the table and for our audience at the back to ask some questions from this excellent panel that we have. Before we start and before I hand it off to my colleague, Senator Gagné, just some logistics things. There's coffee for those of you who are frozen from walking here this morning, or those of you who had late night meetings last night. Translation is available. You'll see it on your chairs or around the table. Use the headsets. I use the term loosely. This is your headset. Channel 1 is for English. Channel 2 is for French. And we encourage audience for participation for those of you who are sitting at the back. So if you would like to ask a question, just raise your hand. And Andrew, I pointed out earlier, Sarah, would you put your hand up? And Susanna from my office is here. So if you want to ask a question, just let one of them know and they will give Senator Gagné and I your name. I'd like to now turn to Senator Gagné for her opening remarks.
Merci beaucoup. Bon matin tout le monde. Merci à nos panélistes qui ont bien accepté notre invitation. Nous apprécions beaucoup que vous avez pris le temps de venir à Ottawa et de parler de ce sujet d'importance nationale. Je vais vous donner la chance de vous brancher. Partout au pays, des communautés de toute taille ont été durement touchées par les effets de l'usage abusif et de la dépendance aux opioïdes. En effet, cette crise s'est considérablement intensifiée au cours des dernières années. Elle continue d'avoir des effets dévastateurs sur les gens de tous les horizons, de tous les âges et de tous les milieux socio-économiques. Les données et les innombrables reportages témoignaient du terrible impact sur un si grand nombre d'individus et de familles. Elle affecte toute la société. La crise soulève un certain nombre de questions difficiles relatives à la santé publique, à l'application de la loi, ainsi qu'aux dimensions économiques de la consommation et de l'abus de drogue. Ma ville natale de Winnipeg au Manitoba est en pleine crise de méthamphétamine, une autre substance synthétique dangereuse, un stimulant puissant qui crée une très forte dépendance et qui, elle aussi, a des impacts accablants sur toutes nos communautés. En parcourant le site de l'Office régional de Winnipeg, je constatais qu'il y a une hausse de 1200% de personnes hospitalisées en raison de l'usage du crystal meth de 2013 à 2018. Alors, le crystal meth n'est pas un opioïde. Il reste que des questions similaires peuvent se poser concernant les facteurs qui contribuent à l'usage et à l'abus de ces substances. So along with my colleagues around the table, I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. So Senator Cordy, if you could introduce our first panelist.
Thank you, Senator Gagne. Our first panelist this morning is Dr. Sherry Fandry. Dr. Fandry received her bachelor's degree in pharmacy and her PhD in toxicology from the University of Saskatchewan. She's currently a clinical assistant professor in the College of Pharmacy at the University of Manitoba, and she's on the executive committee of the Prairie Node of the Canadian Research Initiative in Substance Misuse. She is also a member of the Advisory Council for the organization Drug Free Kids Canada. Dr. Fandry has been working in the field of addictions and mental health for over 15 years, and she's a specialist when it comes to communicating knowledge in a way that reduces stigma and fosters positive relationships. Dr. Fandry provides professional education about addictions and substance abuse to educators, social workers, pharmacists, physicians, and nurses in Manitoba. In her current role, Dr. Fandry is responsible for providing input into the strategic direction of the Manitoba Addictions Knowledge Exchange Center with the goal of enhancing addiction services in Manitoba. Dr. Fandry.
Good morning, honorable senators, committee members, and members of the public. I would like to thank the chairs today for today's event, the Honorable Jane Cordy, the Honorable Raymond Gagne, and the Honorable Senator Balmara as well, for the opportunity to address such a critical topic. I will be providing a very brief overview of a number of key concepts to better frame today's discussion. The overall economic cost of substance use in Canada in 2014 was estimated to be $38.4 billion. This estimate represents a cost of approximately $1,100 for every Canadian man, woman, and child. This came with a staggering toll of 67,515 deaths. While we need to acknowledge that we are in the midst of an opioid overdose crisis, it is worth noting that 2/3 of the costs of substances in Canada arise from alcohol and tobacco. Canada continues to experience a serious opioid crisis. Across the country, it is having devastating effects on the health and lives of many Canadians, their families, and their communities. 2017 is the most recent year for which we have complete data, about 4,000 deaths. Tragically, more than 9,000 people lost their lives in Canada in the 1.5 years between January 2016 and June 2018 related to opioids. This equates to people dying from illicit drug overdose every day. The opioid epidemic has affected every part of the country. However, certain regions have been impacted more than others. In Manitoba, the situation has been greatly complicated by a rapid and marked increase in the use of methamphetamine since 2015. Many of the opioid-related deaths have been attributed to fentanyl or carfentanil added to methamphetamine without users' knowledge. So in this illustration, the green bars indicate when methamphetamine was detected in an overdose death. Given the widespread impact of the problem, curbing the opioid crisis lies in wide-scale, integrated solutions with contributions from all impacted sectors. The public health approach provides insight into how to drive the kinds of collaborative, creative solutions needed to tackle this epidemic. Many Canadians use substances, and the vast majority do so in a responsible and moderate fashion. There are different levels of intervention depending on where you are in the spectrum of substance use. Intervention at lower levels of risk is more effective in terms of cost and success. Addiction involves pleasure and pain, motivation and impulsivity. It has its roots in both genetics and the environment. Early, experimental, social substance use is motivated largely by the positive reinforcement of the substance. It feels good. Increasing amounts and frequency of use may lead down the path to compulsive use, which is driven by negative reinforcement. Once a person is addicted to a substance, they no longer talk about how good it feels. We really don't have an opioid crisis or a methamphetamine crisis. We have a trauma crisis, a housing crisis, a poverty crisis, a stigma crisis. Fentanyl and methamphetamine are symptoms of unmet needs. One of the most important questions to consider about substance use is, why do people use substances? The main motivations for substance use fall into two general categories: to feel good or to feel better. Problematic substance use disproportionately affects those with low income, the unemployed, people with disabilities, and Indigenous communities. Stressful environmental conditions, especially early trauma, can increase the risk of substance use. We attribute the attraction to opioids to their ability to reduce physical pain. They are equally effective at numbing psychological pain, trauma, and suffering. We know childhood trauma is linked to many adverse health outcomes, including early death. These early adverse experiences are cumulative in the way they impact later health outcomes. Adults reporting 5 or more types of abuse in their childhood were 3 times more likely to use prescription pain medication, 5 times more likely to use substances through injection. We need to consider the effects of colonization on Indigenous communities as well. This model has been expanded to encompass the effects of trauma and social location on communities of color. So beyond the original model, we have both the generational embodiment, historical trauma, social conditions, and the local context. Trauma is historical, structural, and political. The science, for example, epigenetics, has finally caught up. Impacts of trauma are embodied across generations in these communities. Differentiated response would look like white communities being validated, empathized, resourced, restored, while communities of colors are shamed, questioned, ignored, stigmatized, and criminalized. We must resist the urge to look for simple solutions to the current overdose epidemic. The factors that either contribute to or detract from positive mental and physical health are complex and interrelated. There is no silver bullet. In Canada, our drug strategy has consistently focused on 4 pillars in their approach to problematic substance use. In the past, drug strategy in Canada has largely focused on law enforcement and community safety. In the past several years, more emphasis has been placed on developing effective harm reduction strategies. Treatment and recovery are still vastly under-resourced. Effective prevention, which has the greatest return on investment of all components, is often completely ignored. Our approach must be cross-sectoral and include multiple levels of government. This model has been modernized to include health promotion, as well as a focus on community safety and collaboration within the context of law enforcement. And as I said, prevention, early intervention have the greatest cost effectiveness, the greatest benefit to cost ratio. We know that they provide high value, positive outcomes at a relatively low cost. Whereas if you wait until people have gone down the stream towards, tumbling off of Niagara Falls, it becomes very, very costly. We need to embrace the value of moving upstream. Finally, a word on some of the barriers to recovery. There are many political, economic, systemic, and social barriers to accessing effective services, and this has contributed to the severity of the current overdose crisis. One common, yet almost invisible barrier is stigma. Stigma is essentially the opposite of hope. And one final word I'd like to leave you with, a final thought. In the words of Johann Hari, author of Chasing the Scream, so the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it is human connection. As we move through my colleagues' presentations regarding their clinical experiences, please keep in mind these overarching principles and concepts. It is my hope that today's discussion represents an important first step in connecting those in despair with the hope for a better future. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup de votre présentation, Dr. Fandry, très appréciée. Je suis certaine que ça va susciter beaucoup de questions et de discussions. La prochaine panéliste est le Dr. Caroline Ozat-Ducassi. Elle est étudiante en 4e année à l'Université McGill de Montréal et médecin résidente en médecine d'urgence. Pendant sa formation, elle s'est également intéressée aux dimensions éthiques, médico-légales et administratives de la médecine. Cet intérêt l'a incité à faire une maîtrise en droit. En plus de la médecine, c'est tout un parcours. En droit et politique de la santé à l'Université de Sherbrooke pendant sa 3e année de résidence. Elle a consacré sa dernière dissertation à la crise des opioïdes en mettant l'accent sur le rôle des prescripteurs dans la genèse de la crise, mais aussi sur la façon dont les prescripteurs et d'autres acteurs peuvent contribuer à l'atténuer. Dr. Caroline Ducassi.
Merci. Donc, hello everybody. I'm going to continue in French just because it's easier for me to summarize the subject in my native language, but I'm very comfortable in answering any question in English for any of you who wants to ask questions. So I think Sénateur Gagné very well introduced me. Alors, aujourd'hui, mon but est vraiment, dans le fond, de résumer les facteurs systémiques qui ont contribué à la crise des opioïdes, particulièrement le rôle des prescripteurs. Je crois que Dr. Fandry a fait un très bon résumé de tous les facteurs individuels et sociaux qui peuvent pousser les gens dans le contexte de la dépendance aux opioïdes. Mais je crois qu'on voit vraiment les médecins et les prescripteurs d'opioïdes comme, dans le fond, l'opportunité pour ces gens-là d'expérimenter une première fois un contact avec les opioïdes, qui sont des substances euphorisantes, comme Dr. Fandry l'a expliqué. Donc, la crise des opioïdes, on en parle vraiment depuis le début des années 90, où on a vu une hausse fulgurante du nombre de prescriptions remises par les médecins des opioïdes, qui sont des médicaments qu'on utilise couramment en pratique clinique pour soulager la douleur. Mais il y a eu des médicaments développés par les pharmaceutiques dans ces années-là, qui sont à plus longue durée d'action, qui peuvent se prendre par la bouche 1 ou 2 fois par jour. Donc, ça a facilité, si on veut, la prescription par les médecins. En parallèle de cette hausse des prescriptions-là, on a vraiment vu une hausse de la morbidité et de la mortalité liée aux opioïdes. Donc oui, on parle beaucoup des overdoses, des décès qui surviennent principalement dans la rue. Donc les gens qui décèdent d'opioïdes, on ne les voit pas arriver à l'urgence, malheureusement. Il est trop tard pour faire quoi que ce soit pour eux. Mais on voit beaucoup d'autres effets secondaires des opioïdes. Par exemple, les personnes âgées qui s'en font prescrire en doses trop grandes, qui deviennent confuses, qui chutent, qui se brisent une hanche. Tout ça représente un fardeau immense pour le système de santé. Donc, juste pour montrer un peu l'interaction qui peut exister entre une prescription et, dans le fond, les décès liés aux opioïdes. On sait que la douleur, qu'elle soit aiguë ou la douleur chronique, qui est un problème majeur de santé actuellement aussi, sur lequel on pourrait discuter pendant des heures également, peut amener les gens à aller, dans le fond, consulter un médecin qui, pour différents facteurs sur lesquels je vais revenir, pourra leur remettre une prescription qui souvent va être inappropriée d'opioïdes. Cette prescription-là, comme je disais, c'est la première opportunité pour ces gens-là de consommer des opioïdes. et un certain pourcentage des gens ont des facteurs de risque que Dr. Fendry a résumé pour développer une consommation problématique et développer une dépendance aux opioïdes. Tout ça, ça va les amener dans un cercle vicieux de vouloir consommer de plus en plus. Éventuellement, vont retourner chez leur médecin qui, parfois, va leur en represcrire, mais parfois va devoir cesser cette prescription-là parce qu'il va se rendre compte qu'il y a un problème avec la consommation. Puis, dans le fond, éventuellement, ces gens-là vont se tourner vers le marché noir qui, dans le fond, en ce moment, est contaminé avec beaucoup d'opioïdes synthétiques là, à haute puissance, comme le fentanyl et le fentanyl. Et ces gens-là vont éventuellement être victimes d'une surdose, voire d'un décès. Donc, les médecins, on a des bonnes pratiques pour nous guider, des guides de pratique cliniques, des lignes directrices qui nous encouragent à, dans le fond, prescrire de façon appropriée des opioïdes. Par contre, ces guides-là reposent tous sur deux très grands principes qui sont clairs, mais qui restent très vagues, c'est-à-dire de donner la bonne dose au bon patient. Donc, tous les guides reviennent à dire qu'il faut donner la plus faible dose efficace d'opioïdes pour la plus courte durée possible, mais sans jamais vraiment donner de chiffres sur c'est quoi une faible dose, c'est quoi une courte durée de traitement. Quand il parle aussi de la sélection du bon patient, on parle vraiment de sélectionner le bon type de douleur. C'est-à-dire des douleurs de type vraiment physique comme un bras cassé, une plaie post-opératoire, des choses comme ça, mais sans jamais rentrer sur le type de douleur qui ne devrait pas être soigné avec des opioïdes. On parle de toutes les douleurs chroniques, les douleurs qui sont liées plus à des facteurs psychologiques et tout ça. L'autre problème, c'est qu'on dit dans le fond, si les autres alternatives ne fonctionnent pas, mais qu'est-ce qu'on fait si on n'a pas accès à ces alternatives-là, ce qui est un problème dans le système de santé actuellement. Puis on dit aussi qu'il faut sélectionner des patients qui ont un faible risque individuel de surdose et de dépendance, mais on se rend compte qu'en pratique clinique, c'est très, très difficile de faire ce jugement-là en quelques minutes. Donc, pourquoi les médecins prescrivent trop d'opioïdes ou les prescrivent mal? La première chose, je pense qu'il y a eu un gros courant dans les années 90 aussi de vouloir éliminer la douleur à tout prix. La douleur est devenue comme le 5e signe vital. Il y a eu des mouvements disant que c'était un droit humain de voir la douleur soulagée. Donc, je pense que les médecins ont vraiment eu une pression énorme de la part des patients, mais aussi des administrateurs d'hôpitaux de vouloir à tout prix soulager la douleur. Puis, on ne peut pas mettre de côté le marketing des compagnies pharmaceutiques de vraiment que les opioïdes, c'était une solution miracle, que ça allait rendre tout le monde heureux, fonctionnel sur le marché du travail, puis pour vaquer à leurs activités. On sait que ce n'est pas le cas. Il y a d'autres facteurs dans le système de santé qui, malheureusement, contribuent au fait qu'on prescrit les opioïdes de façon inappropriée. Premièrement, les listes d'attente, le manque de temps, ça donne que quelques minutes pour parler avec un patient qui parfois souffre autant au niveau psychologique que physique depuis des années. Aussi, les médecins, on se fait dire de faire attention parce qu'il y a des gens qui vont simuler de la douleur pour obtenir des opioïdes, mais on ne peut pas commencer comme médecin traitant à mettre en doute la parole de tout le monde. La douleur, c'est quelque chose de subjectif, on ne peut pas juger si c'est vraiment vrai ou non. Donc, encore là, les courts délais dans le système de santé là, ne permettent pas de faire une évaluation appropriée. L'autre chose, c'est qu'il y a d'autres alternatives pour traiter la douleur qu'on sait qu'elles sont efficaces. On pense à la physiothérapie, la psychothérapie, tous les traitements manuels. Malheureusement, ce n'est pas remboursé par les systèmes d'assurance actuellement, que ce soit au niveau fédéral ou provincial. Donc, beaucoup de gens n'ont pas accès à ces traitements-là et les listes d'attente sont également importantes pour les quelques alternatives publiques qui existent. Au niveau plus légal et systémique, je pense qu'il y a un rôle que les collèges des médecins là, provinciaux n'ont pas encore joué, c'est-à-dire de réguler les pratiques de leurs membres. On sait que leur rôle, c'est de protéger le public là, contre, dans le fond, les mauvaises pratiques en médecine. Par contre, il n'y a aucune poursuite au niveau déontologique là, ou civil qui a été faite contre des médecins à quelque niveau que ce soit au Canada. Puis les efforts d'éducation commencent à peine à émerger. Donc, je pense que la plupart des médecins ne sont pas mal intentionnés et ne veulent pas nuire à leurs patients. Par contre, il y a un gros travail là, de déboursoyage qui doit être fait au niveau là, de qui prescrit quoi, quand et comment. Puis d'aller, dans le fond, sensibiliser ces gens-là en leur disant votre pratique, elle est vraiment atypique par rapport à la moyenne. Vous devez vous réajuster puis de leur offrir des formations à ce niveau-là. Je pense aussi que le système d'information en santé doit être amélioré. Il faut que les médecins aient facilement accès à l'historique de leurs patients. Souvent, les patients se présentent à l'urgence, on n'a aucune idée de quels médicaments ils prennent, de leurs antécédents médicaux. D'avoir un système de santé informatisé là, à travers les provinces, voire au niveau fédéral, je pense que ce serait un minimum là, en 2019 pour pouvoir bien pratiquer. Donc, il y a quand même des dilemmes là, face à la régulation des opioïdes. On ne veut pas surprescrire les opioïdes pour ne pas entraîner de dépendance. On ne veut pas non plus laisser des gens en souffrance, surtout avec les gens en fin de vie. Je pense que les opioïdes sont des médicaments qui se doivent d'être disponibles. On ne peut pas juste les bannir complètement. Je pense que les médecins ont un devoir de suivi avec les patients auxquels ils prescrivent ces médicaments-là, mais il ne faut pas, dans le fond, oublier la réalité du terrain qui est qu'il y a un manque d'accès là, aux médecins de première ligne actuellement. Aussi, c'est difficile d'obtenir le consentement éclairé d'un patient, lui expliquer les risques-bénéfices des opioïdes quand il est en douleur ou victime de dépendance, puis juste à la recherche de sa prochaine dose d'opioïdes. Puis je pense que oui, il faut mieux encadrer les médecins, mais il ne faut pas non plus les criminaliser puis mettre comme un espèce de sentiment de peur et de surveillance là, au niveau là, de la pratique des professionnels. Donc, les pistes de solutions, je pense que ça se résume vraiment au niveau de l'éducation, l'information et une meilleure communication, autant auprès des médecins que des patients. Je pense qu'il faut investir dans la technologie pour permettre là, de mieux connaître, dans le fond, son patient qui est devant nous, favoriser la collaboration interprofessionnelle, que ce soit entre médecins, pharmaciens et autres professionnels de santé qui peuvent offrir des solutions à la douleur, puis investir en recherche. Mais merci.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hussat Tukasi. Our next presenter is Dr. Turnbull. And Dr. Turnbull, welcome back to Parliament Hill. I know you spent a lot of time on Parliament Hill when you were president of the Canadian Medical Association. So welcome back. And Dr. Turnbull is co-founder and medical director of Ottawa Inner City Health, an organization which works to improve health and access to healthcare services for people who are chronically homeless. From 2008 to 2017, Dr. Turnbull served as Chief of Staff of the Ottawa Hospital, and prior to this, he was also Chief of Clinical Quality for Health Quality Ontario. Dr. Turnbull remains committed as a medical educator with special interests in poverty and health inequity and associated health policy both nationally and internationally. So welcome, Dr. Turnbull.
Very much. It's a great honor to be here, and I'd like to thank our chairs and all those honorable members for hearing me out. The perspective I'll give today, if you'll allow me, is that of a frontline care provider, somebody who is addressing or attempting to address this challenge every day. And just to give you a sense as well of, this is not a homogeneous problem. It's a very heterogeneous problem. So the group of individuals that I see are those people less than a kilometer from here who are living in circumstances comparable to where I work in the developing world of Bangladesh, Nigeria, Kenya, and the Balkans. Their life expectancy and outcomes are worse than many of those jurisdictions. And that's less than a kilometer from here. So I care for the chronically homeless, those people with mental health, and the majority of them have an addiction. And so that's a unique population, so I wanted to be very clear that that's the part of the elephant that I look at. And so we provide comprehensive services for that community, from primary prevention to secondary prevention, primary care, specialized care, end-of-life care. But of course, the majority of our challenges relate to mental health and addictions because that's what the majority of our clients experience. Just to put this in some context, probably 5 years ago, I said the worst thing that could ever happen to me was crack cocaine. We had alcohol, non-beverage alcohol. We had some crystal meth. We had then crack cocaine, and that changed everything. I didn't think it could get worse until the opioid crisis came. About 2 years ago, I was seeing approximately 1 or 2 heroin addicts at any one time. I would see probably 2 overdoses in a month. I now have 150 heroin addicts. I have 5 overdoses every day. And with that, the concomitant associated mortality. To address this crisis, and just to give you some sense, what we've tried to do is we've developed a safe injection facility where we could supervise individuals injecting and enter them into treatment modalities. We were funded for about 80 visits per day. Our first day we opened at 120 visits, and we haven't looked back since. We have about 150 visits. every day, less than a kilometer from here. There were some people who were overdosing about 3 times per week. Very high risk to themselves and to others as a result of their opioid use. And so we took those individuals, and because of the toxic drug supply, which I'll describe in a minute, we started to give them intravenous opioid replacement therapy to stabilize their lives. So we've been forced into a pattern, a practice, just to deal with today's extraordinary circumstances of the opioid epidemic. Let me also describe that when we started, this was prescription opioids. Then came fentanyl, game changer. I didn't think that could get worse until carfentanil came. Now we have aquafentanyl, terfentanil, and we have other opioids that just has numbers now. When we test our drug supply that people are injecting within a kilometer from here, and they say I'm taking heroin or purple heroin, the one thing it does not have in it is heroin. It's fentanyl, carfentanil, or other derivatives that are so potent that they cause an enormous amount of morbidity and mortality for injection drug users. So that's the context that I deal with every day. I see young people, I see adolescents, I see people who are on average 30 to 37, males, white often, but a very significant component of our Indigenous community as well. Now, what are some of the lessons that I've learned in trying to address this challenge? Some of them are the drug supply is hugely toxic. There used to be a safe drug supply, or people used to say, oh, I can trust my dealer. That is totally incorrect. Carfentanil and fentanyl is in the crack cocaine. It's in all other the methamphetamines, as we've heard, and it is the heroin that we're dealing with. And because it's so potent, it makes other oral replacement therapies like methadone or Suboxone ineffective. It makes my management of overdoses so complicated. 1 dose of naloxone, 2 doses used to be fine. Now it's 10 doses of naloxone. Remember, the kits only have 2 doses. So the drug supply is toxic. And then the other thing you should know about it is it's changing. It's not changing over the course of months or years. It's changing by weeks. So whatever we do and however we respond, you have to understand we have to respond in terms of weeks. We don't do that well in health services delivery, in any of the other facets in trying to address the opioid crisis, such as social services. So the drug supply is toxic. Traditional approaches that we've had towards abstinence-based treatment facilities, residential often, 21 days. You've already heard that this is a complex problem arising from complex circumstances, mental health issues, histories of trauma. These are not going to be solved in 21 days in a residential treatment facility. And besides, once you're abstinent, as this is a chronic relapsing disorder, if you do relapse, you've lost your tolerance, you get out into using the drug supply, which is toxic and very potent, and that's when you're going to overdose. You come into my hospital, we'll make you abstinent for a period of 7 days and allow you then to go back into the community and put yourself at very high risk. If you're incarcerated, same circumstances. So some of our usual approaches are actually making people worse and making the crisis even more prominent. Other thing I'd like to say that is oral replacement therapies, which are good for many people, and we send 30 people per month to oral replacement from our safe injection facility. But for many, that's insufficient, so we must think of other opportunities, such as intravenous replacement therapy, which is very, very challenging. And then we've heard about the history of trauma, colonization, poverty, lack of housing, education. All of those things have to be culturally appropriate care, and it's time-consuming. Many of these individuals that I care for, those are people who are treating their trauma, they're treating their mental health with the opioids inappropriately. And so we have to be able to offer them something better, yet those facilities don't often exist easily within our community and not within the grasp of many of the people that I serve who can't, they live in such crisis every day. It's, what am I going to do not tomorrow or the week after? It's what am I going to do in the next 12 minutes to address the voices, my depression, and my addiction. So it's a world filled with crisis, and it's very short-term solutions for them that are going to be effective. The other things I'd like to say is that we need all aspects of comprehensive therapy, from harm reduction to treatment to prevention. And I think that as we move ahead, we're going to have to think that we have to now start to work with all of our colleagues, housing colleagues, judicial colleagues, social services colleagues, those people that look into entitlements, etc. And then as for the origin of the crisis as one of our questions, I agree exactly with all of the things that have been said about the origin of the crisis. But in my world at this moment, prescription opioids is not the problem that's killing people. Those days are gone for me. It's fentanyl, carfentanil, and those are easily available within about 100 yards from here, and horribly toxic. So whereas we have to stop getting more people addicted, I appreciate that, and I'm totally supportive of it, and we should ensure that we inform our physicians and make sure that they practice well. But at the moment, we have a crisis outside that's killing people that's probably not prescription opioids. It's the potent synthetic opioids that have followed that. Enforcement, we have to work with our enforcement colleagues, and treatment facilities have to be prolonged, addressing the complexity of the circumstances that brought people to the setting where they are dependent. But we have to stabilize those individuals first and prevent them from dying from an overdose. And you have to understand, if somebody's overdosing 3 times a week, it's only going to be a matter of days before they die. And so the last thing I would leave you with is to say that this crisis is forcing us to really think about where we should be in terms of drug policy and how we try and enforce a drug policy system. And should we be penalizing those people who unfortunately are desperate enough to take opioids as injection drug users? Or should we be trying to move our efforts towards preventing the crisis in the first place? And so I'd ask all of us to really think about, is this the pathway that's leading us to success at the moment? Because I personally am not feeling that. Or do we have to ask ourselves much more fundamental questions about where are we with drug policy in this country? Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Turnbull. Ça fait choc. Merci. Ça va susciter certainement beaucoup de questions. Notre 4e présentation sera donnée par Dr. Esther Tailfeathers. Dr. Esther Tailfeathers est née et a grandi dans la réserve Blood Reserve en Alberta. Dr. Tailfeathers est présentement la responsable médicale de la population et du public, Indigenous Strategy Care Network. Elle a travaillé dans de nombreuses communautés autochtones, notamment les réserves Blackfeet et Blood Reserve, pendant près de 17 ans, en plus de desservir la communauté isolée de Fort Chipewyan. Je l'ai bien, did I pronounce that right? Fort Chipewyan est situé au nord de la province et plus récemment, elle a travaillé avec sa communauté en réponse à la crise du fentanyl qui a commencé à l'automne 2014. Dr. Tailfeathers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be invited to this table. Such distinguished people and such caring people for the people of Canada. Thank you, Senator Cordy, Gagné, and Senator Bellemare for the invitation to come, and all of Senate to give the opportunity to speak about what I think is a case scenario of what happens to Indigenous communities. Also to my fellow panelists for the great presentations and the amount of knowledge that we have collectively, and hopefully help for moving forward. Anyway, my community is the Blood Reserve. It's a reserve in southern Alberta, which is the largest reserve land-wise in Canada and has a population of 13,000. Most of those people living on reserve, with a population of about 7,000. In the fall of 2014, we started seeing some overdose deaths, and I work in the emergency room, and we started seeing, increasing overdose deaths and a number of people coming into the emergency room. We were not screening for fentanyl. We were screening for the typical opioids that we see in overdose. And when we started seeing that it was using more and more naloxone to be able to reverse the overdoses, we started screening for other opioids, and fentanyl came up on the screen. Originally, it was thought that it probably came from an animal or a veterinarian and was being distributed that way, and we were looking for where it was originating from. Anyway, in my community, we started seeing deaths, sometimes 2 to 3 a week, mostly young people between the ages of 20 and 30. And that range actually has expanded to 14 to 60 in terms of overdose deaths in our community. And we had to do something. We didn't see this happening anywhere else in the province and in the country, as we were one of the first communities to start experiencing the deaths. So we had a huge discussion on what are we going to do for solutions in our community. And the biggest and most difficult discussion is a discussion concerning abstinence versus harm reduction. Many of our people are still in the alcohol treatment or the alcohol addiction journey, which is mostly abstinence-based. And so when we started talking about, number one, instituting naloxone on our reserve when it wasn't used anywhere else in the province, let alone the country, by lay people, it was a huge discussion. And many of the older people or people that didn't understand it asked, well, aren't we enabling them? And one of the people at the table said, well, you can't enable a dead body. So people started to recognize that harm reduction was the route that we had to take. So we went and did an all-out blitz. We brought naloxone to the reserve. We did train the trainer. We trained and had a number of huge community sessions where we trained people to use naloxone and to have it at hand at home. So between August 2014 and March 2015, we experienced at least 20 deaths in our community, if not more. And on March the 30th, because of the work that was done with the naloxone, for 3 months we had 0 deaths in our community related to overdoses because we instituted naloxone. Nowhere else in the province or the country had a First Nations done this, and at one point there were no rules by Health Canada, so we went ahead and did it because there were no rules, and there was some there were some repercussions. But I think now now that the country is using naloxone, I think that we were actually rewarded. The second step that we took was the introduction of opiate replacement therapy, and we started working on licensing ourselves with Suboxone, and only 2 physicians on reserve received the permission to use Suboxone. Nobody out of our colleagues was interested in prescribing Suboxone, and there are many colleagues area that that could have helped and still haven't helped. So the burden lays on those physicians who are prescribing opiate replacement therapy and are not supported by the physicians around them who should be actually starting to use evidence-based medicine and opiate replaced therapy. We also started some harm reduction projects. In August of this year, we instituted a mobile Suboxone unit, which services the people on the reserve that are very far from the clinics or from the pharmacies, many of them single mothers with children who cannot travel to the pharmacies on a daily basis, and for many reasons are not able to travel for Suboxone or methadone. We also tried a safe consumption site. In February of this year, we had what was called a perfect storm, where we had a storm, a physical blizzard, and at the same time, money came into the community and dealers swooped down into the community and left carfentanyl and left the community, but left the minor dealers to deal the carfentanyl. Within a 5-hour period, the overdoses had started, and we had 14 overdoses overnight, and the city of Lethbridge had 50 overdoses, 50, and that resulted in 2 deaths. Our emergency crews had to go across or make it through the blizzard conditions to homes where at one instant 5 people had overdosed and were on the floor, and there were only 2 responders trying to save lives. So it was a perfect storm. The province, AHS, Alberta Health Services, responded with we asked for a safe consumption site. And normally a safe consumption site takes many months, up to a year, to get the license and get up and running. But they were able to get the safe consumption site, a mobile unit, to our reserve within 3 weeks. We opened the safe consumption site hoping that it would save people, and because of stigma in our community, only 2 people used a safe consumption site, which was for the use of witnessed opioid use. And as a result, the safe consumption site was given to another community that needed it and did not have the strong stigma that our community had. And just recently, we opened a safe withdrawal site. We had another perfect storm in November, and we had been working on what's called a safe withdrawal site. And what that is that we recognize that the people that are using are no longer just simply using fentanyl or carfentanyl. They're mixing with crack cocaine, they're mixing with crystal meth, and they're doing speedballs and downers, and the terms that you learn from the patients. And even if you give them naloxone in an overdose, after the naloxone is given, there's a strong physical reaction to the crystal meth, or the crystal meth coming through in the process. So it's become a very mixed picture for the people in our community. Here's a picture of the overdose services, or the overdose stats. And I know it's not very big, but what we've done is we've kept track of the overdoses in the community, and we've watched a pattern. What we see in the reserve is that every time that there's money in the community, the dealers come in and there's a spike in overdoses. And so the reserve does need to respond to how do we deal with that when it's low income and people are reliant on the income that they have, but how do we, it's a human right to spend your money on what you decide you want to spend it on. How do we approach that? Some of the underlying reasons for the crisis is historic trauma, and my colleagues have talked about historic trauma, and I just wanted to bring the attention to the greatest trauma, which is residential school, and the legacy that it has left in terms of the adverse childhood experiences within Indigenous communities. And I think that the visuals that my colleague here had given on the ACEs, I will use as well, but that has made the greatest impact in terms of trauma in our communities, and it has continued. So addressing it by apologizing was wonderful. Addressing it by rewarding or paying people for the amount of pain that they endured while in residential school was another thing, but we still haven't addressed it, and it's ongoing in terms of the intergenerational trauma. And I think this is one of the primary reasons why Indigenous people are experiencing addictions and death due to addictions. The second one is social determinants, and the greatest one of the social determinants is poverty. And I will speak to that as well. The third one is health service delivery, and I think that it's not one that's spoken about very often, but it has to do with primary care and prescription drug overprescribing. Most Indigenous communities in this country do not have primary care physicians that live in community or that are consistently serving community. Most of the Indigenous communities in our country are served primarily by either locums or people coming and going from the community. They are also, the physicians that go to community are also very poorly educated on the culture and the people and the history in that community. So they do not have that common ground, or they do not understand the common ground of the patients in that community and the historical contexts of residential school and historical trauma. In most provinces, primary care is delivered by fee-for-service, which forces physicians to serve a number of patients to be able to pay for their services. And when they have to travel to remote communities, sometimes that doesn't happen, and many physicians give up on traveling to remote communities because it just isn't worth their time. So fee-for-service is a model that has done a lot of damage to Indigenous communities across the country. And those fee-for-service models, because physicians are stressed to try to treat patients, it's so easy to write a prescription for opioids. And I think that the overprescribing has, as well as the trauma, has led to the initial overuse of opioids in our communities. I won't dwell on this slide, which is the adverse experience study that Kaiser Permanente did, and I think it speaks directly to what is happening in Indigenous communities. The very top of the ACEs study talks about life expectancy, and in Alberta, the average life expectancy is 12 years less for an Indigenous person than it is for a non-Indigenous person. And there are many reasons for that, but part of that is the ACEs. This is a slide on the opioid dispensations for First Nations people compared to non-First Nations people in Alberta. And if you look at the slide, the blue figures on the blue graph on the side is the non-First Nations females and non-First Nations males. That's on the left side. And on the right side is the First Nations females and the First Nations male population being prescribed opiates. And if you look at that even for a moment, you will see that there is a huge imbalance between the prescription of opioids to First Nations versus non-First Nations. And why does that happen? Income status, I just wanted to make a short comment on the difference in income status for the First Nations people in Canada versus the non-First Nations or non-Aboriginal people. And across the board, even though an Indigenous person has the same education as a non-Indigenous person, the level of income is always less. And there needs to be some discussion on why that happens. First Nation stats from Alberta First Nations Nations Information Governance Center. The rate of opioid toxicity deaths was 3 times higher for First Nations versus non-First Nations in Alberta. The rate of emergency department visits related to opioids and substances of misuse were 6 times higher. The rate of hospitalizations related to opioids and substances of misuse were 5 times higher. The rate of EMS responses to opioid-related events in Edmonton and Calgary was 7 times higher, and the rate of opioid dispensing from community pharmacies was 2 times higher. The concern that we have is with the community and addressing the deaths and overdoses, but we also have to look at what's happening to our children. And we're recognizing that there's an increase in traumatic experiences. Our children are witnessing the overdosing of their parents in front of them, and the EMS coming to respond to the overdose of the patient. And it's quite traumatic for children to either wake up to their parents dead, or to be witness to a resuscitation in their home. There's a greater increase in substance misuse at a younger age. 5 days ago, we had a 14-year-old that overdosed on fentanyl, and 2 days ago, we had a 14-year-old that hung herself because of the amount of drug use in her home and around her. There's an increase in children going into foster care. There's an increase in neonatal abstinence syndrome, and that includes all of the drugs that we're talking about: fentanyl, the synthetic opioids, as well as crystal meth, crack cocaine, and alcohol as well. And our tribe has an average of 100 births per year, which makes it really easy for me to calculate percentages. So the first year, 2014, 24 babies were born into neonatal abstinence and had an extended stay in hospital because they needed to be withdrawn from the drugs which were in their system. The second year, 2015, it went up to 29, and then 34, and in the last year, it was 39%. That's almost 40% of our babies are being born into neonatal abstinence, and we have no idea what the repercussions of that are within the next 20 years, 10 to 20 years, and we need to address that. There's been an increase in poverty in our children. They're in some places where they have not been hungry. Many children are going hungry throughout the day because the money is being spent on immediate need for the opioids or for the drugs of choice, and the children are going without food. And also we're seeing an increase in children recruited into the sex trade, and it's younger and younger, as young as 14 to 16 years of age, mostly young girls, but that does include boys as well. What are we going to do as a collective? We need to address poverty and the social determinants of health. We need to recognize that trauma and that trauma-informed care is needed as part of the treatment and recovery of our patients. We need to address addictions issues in our community and institute harm reduction and support it. We need to increase the scale and scope of treatment in Indigenous communities. We need to share positive outcomes and programs. We need to share amongst ourselves what is helping in community. We need a collaborative effort between education, health, and children's services, as well as, I didn't add to this, justice and our political bodies as well. We need to recognize the role of primary care in this crisis and addressing the needs of primary care for Indigenous people across the country. And we need to begin new pain management strategies which are not opioid-based. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tailfeathers. I have to say, I thought I was reasonably well read on the opioid crisis, but after listening to not even all of our witnesses, I'm just in shock. Anyway, our last presenter this morning is Dr. John Weeks, who is Director of Research and Academics at the Waypoint Research Institute, a part of the Waypoint Center for Mental Health Care in Pentagouchene. Go ahead. Thank you. Which is in Ontario. Dr. Weeks is also an adjunct research professor of forensic psychology and addictions at Carleton University and an assistant clinical professor of psychiatry and behavioral neurosciences at the School of Medicine at McMaster University. He's an internationally recognized expert in addictions, particularly for individuals involved in the criminal justice system, and he serves as a drug strategy advisor for numerous domestic and foreign governments in the areas of harm reduction, treatment efficacy, evidence-based practice, and digital interventions for problematic use of alcohol and other drugs. Dr. Weeks.
Hi, good morning. Just to underscore one of the comments that Jeff made,
I'd like to do a little exercise with you. I know you've been sitting for a while, so rather than, you're not going to be standing up and stretching, but I'd like you to put up your hand if you've ever tried to change an aspect of your behavior. For example, lose weight, get exercise. I mean, we're just like 6 weeks from New Year's, right? Everybody's hand. Just for the record, and for those who can't, no, keep your hand up. Keep your hand. If you ever, it's like, lose weight. I actually just lose weight and exercise. That just did it for everybody. But biting your nails, forgetting, don't pick your nose in public, and so on. So, if you still have your hand up, keep your hand up. If you've tried to change that behavior and it worked for a while, and then you kind of reverted back to your former habit. Okay, just for the record, and for those who can't see on screen, everybody kept their hand up. So if that's, you can put your hand down now. Or you can leave it up if you want. If that's the case, with the kinds of things, whatever it was that you just thought about, that aspect of your behavior, why and how could we think and expect people who have been engaged in drug use, as Jeffrey commented, basically all day, every day, to change their behavior? The majority of the clients, if I put on my clinician's hat, when I was a clinical psychologist, now I'm in management. I probably am safer that way. But truly, if the majority of people, I think it's fair to say the majority of people I worked with either can't stop or won't stop. What are we going to do? Say, oh, sorry, can't help you. Why don't you come back when you're able to change your behavior? No, we don't work. It doesn't work like that. A very good colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Diane Rothan, one of the former coroners of British Columbia, mused to me across a table like this one time a few years ago. She introduced me to harm reduction about 20 years ago. She said, hey, John, what do you think are long-term abstinence for people who are seriously dependent on one or more drugs? Maybe 10%? 1 in 10. Now, that's not that scientific on Diane's part. I don't think she was trying to imply that. But if that's the case, even ballpark, this really, I think, underscores the phenomenon, the human behavior that we're dealing with, that Jeffrey's comment, it's a chronically relapsing condition. In contemporary intervention, this is how we recognize and work with people. That's why notions about reduced use, moderated use, and so on have been so much into the fore, is recognizing the realities. While abstinence may be what the gold standard, what we would hope to achieve for an individual whose life is in complete chaos, the realities, the realistic side of it is it's not achievable for that person. So I'm going to make a few brief comments about the population I've spent most of my career, last 30 years working with, that's involved people in the criminal justice system. But I would like to say merci beaucoup à tout le monde. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I have the honor of living and working in the land of the Anishinaabe and ancestrally the Huron-Wendat people in Penetanguishene, which in Ojibwe means, our healer at the hospital tells me it means one of two things. We have lots of both, the land of the rolling hills and the land of the rolling sands. So I'd also like to recognize the fact that we are on unceded Algonquin land. And so I would say Chimugwech for the opportunity for all of us to be here and exchange this really important public health emergency. So I've worked in the criminal justice system for about 30 years with people who are one way wrapped up in our jails and prisons and so on. The research that I've been involved with, and it's not just my research, people I've worked with and I'm aware of, the estimates are around prevalence, conservatively, small c, around between 7 out of 10 to maybe even 8 out of 10 individuals who come into contact with the criminal justice system, wind up in a prison or jail in Canada, are engaged in problematic use. And as Sherry quite rightly pointed out, in terms of the range of intervention responses that we offer, those correspond to the level of severity associated with their problematic use. And notice I'm distinguishing between use and problematic use. And then sort of like, if you conceptualize it on a continuum, at the far end is extreme use, and really many of the people who Jeffrey is working to support as a human service provider and healthcare provider are at the extreme end by virtue of his brief description. I think that was probably pretty clear. As severity goes up, the severity of an individual's problem goes up, so does the likelihood they're engaging in, for people involved in the criminal justice system, and I assume elsewhere, so does the likelihood that they're engaging in consuming a variety of drugs, including opioids. Or, but I think it's sort of subsumed with under the term, and I wanted to put it out if you're not familiar with it, novel psychoactive substances. These are compounds and synthetics, semi-synthetics that are constantly evolving and changing. And one of the big challenges for healthcare providers and indeed for legislators in Canada and elsewhere in the world, it's really problematic in the UK, something I'm familiar with there, is the changing nature of what it is that the compound it consists of. Tweak it a little bit, now it's different than what the legislators were trying to get their heads around. As the severity goes up, so does the likelihood of criminal involvement that's either directly or indirectly related to consumption. Directly related, under the influence at the time a crime was committed. Indirectly, or what we refer to as acquisitive crime, crimes committed in order to acquire funds for drugs. Robberies, thefts, and so on, is well established. There's a lot of really great interventions happening in Canada, and I don't know whether you know it, but the Correctional Service of Canada and other agencies in Canada, correctional jurisdictions, are amongst the leaders in the world in terms of a rehabilitative ethic and ideal, and worked actively to assist offenders or people involved in the criminal justice system in changing their behavior and reducing the likelihood of being involved in crime and drug use following release. Are drugs available in prison? Yes, they are. You think, how could that possibly be? This in society is the most secure environment happening, available. And I always think, if you've ever seen that old, it's not that old, but the Simpson movie, where they hermetically seal the town of Springfield over some big dome. I think they keep Homer Simpson out, probably a good thing. Maybe if you could do that to a prison, you could keep drugs out. But because so much traffic going in and out, and now you hear about drone incursions and people like firing arrows over with drugs and pills, and I don't want to give people ideas, but into prisons and so on, it's very, very difficult, despite best efforts, to reduce the availability of supply of drugs to meet the demand within prisons. So as a result, you do have people presenting having consumed who knows what, because that's one of the big things in this. I think the message is, I hope, has been clear here, but the people don't know what they're consuming. It's kind of a white powder, it's small amounts, you've got fentanyl patches, it's easy to get into a prison and so on, despite ion scanners, despite drug dogs, and so on. Very, very difficult. So you have people who literally are consuming toxic levels of some unknown substance, so it's drug poisoning. I've kind of moved away personally from the term drug overdose, just because I think the drug poisoning is more like, unfortunately, the coroner or the toxicological conclusion of what's been going on with the individual. So you do have that occurring within an institution. And there's a little bit of research that we did when I was part of the Correctional Service of Canada. Why I put in the earlier plug for the Correctional Service of Canada, my former agency, was that we looked at overdose. And we found that on average, an individual was about halfway into their prison term when the overdose occurred. And one of the things we were wondering about, because of that, might have their ability to tolerate whatever it was they're consuming has now been diminished. And as a result, they're more susceptible to the kind of toxic response that they have had. The only other thing I'd like to add, I mean, I could go on, as I know all of us could because we're so passionate, and I think you are too. On release, one of the highest risk times for an individual is the initial release. They're trying to catch up. They catch up on a lot of things. Sure you can imagine, and part and parcel of that might be partying up with drugs. It's very, very evident in the literature that the few hours and days on release in the community are the highest risk for consumption of consuming a substance that they don't know what is contained within that substance, and as a result, they consume potentially a toxic and fatal level of the drug, as Jeffrey was talking about, fentanyl, carfentanil, aquafentanil. Actually, you mentioned a couple of I'm not even familiar with, and that's part of it. Even in the business, it's always changing, always evolving, and what's coming next, and so on. So I've gone a little bit over time, so I think I'll stop right there. But thanks, everybody, for your interest and your passion about this incredibly important issue.
Merci, Dr. Weeks. Et comme vous l'avez dit, je pense que c'est un sujet d'importance nationale et je suis certaine qu'il y aura plusieurs questions. Je vois qu'il y a déjà une liste qui commence à se préparer. Nous allons maintenant commencer la partie de questions. Nous avons à peu près une quarantaine de minutes, questions et réponses. Et puis, nous allons commencer avec le sénateur Munson.
Sorry, I wasn't quite ready for
So,
that. So early, but I'm
Senator
ready.
Munson, if you're not ready, maybe.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Yeah, sure. So
I'm ready,
the
but
floor
you
is
know,
yours.
the word I'm ready. The word shock was used by Senator Cordy, and I've been taking notes because I live in the same town here as Dr. Ian Turnbull, and we've shared conversations before in the past as in your other capacity, and this morning, I skated to work the first time, and to the new Senate of Canada building, and I skated to work with great optimism. I skated. The canal was beautiful this morning, and there was just a happy face. And then you talk about, and I know what's happening. It's just less than a block away from the canal this morning at the same time. So it's sobering in many degrees. I'd like to throw your question back to you, Doctor, because I'd like to explore the political aspect of all of this. You talked about it's a world filled with crisis. We only have short-term solutions. And the question you put here, where are we with drug policy in this country? And even in this city, politicians were reticent about having a safe injection site. Couldn't believe it. I had politicians coming to me here locally saying, well, why don't we put it in your neighborhood right in the glebe? And I said, well, why not? Because it's happening in the glebe. We talked about Indigenous people, and we have all surveys about others in poverty and so on and so forth. Well, smart kids, rich kids in this town have died because of this. So it is so troubling. And we have now this injection site here. And I just worry about across the country and where the inaction is with politicians to move this whole thing elsewhere. Because if you put a safe injection site in a small town, it's like, oh, they go to the AA meeting. Oh, that's just down the road. See them walk in there. It's stigmatization. It's all of that. So your message this morning, what would it be to the federal government and the politicians and Health Canada to take even stronger action, a collective action, and a will to face what is, I know the word is overused, crisis. It's beyond that, but just like to have your point of view. Thank you.
I was going to call you Senator. Doctor.
You don't have to be insulting about this.
Dr. Turnbull.
Thank you very much, Senator. I'll begin, and my colleagues perhaps have some additional comments. So the federal government, I think, has several roles to play. I think the first one, and we've heard so importantly, relates to primary prevention, education, and making people aware of the crisis and the risks that they and their families are taking. I think that there's another very fundamental role, and that is as those individuals responsible for our Indigenous communities. I think that they should take this very seriously because the impact is huge in that context, as we've heard. I think at the same time, then, as we start to move towards harm reduction, I think there's an opportunity for us because the federal government regulates opioids, and so through the regulatory responsibilities for heroin, etc., allow harm reduction strategies to move in that direction and make that more clearly available. Our health minister has already committed to that to date. However, I must admit there are still some very significant logistic challenges for myself as a prescriber. Still, that's out of reach for an organization such as mine. So we have movement to go. Now, I think personally that acts supporting safe supervised injection facilities, etc., is really important. However, I think that that's not the solution. if you allow somebody to steal, commit street prostitution, or deal drugs for about $100 a day to get their opioids, then watch them overdose in front of you because they're toxic, and then resuscitate them, and then pat them on the back and say, good work, you're alive now, go back and do that tomorrow. And that's what happens. You know, personally, I think that that is a necessary first step, but we have to have some kind of back end to that. We have to have some way of moving those individuals to treatment. And at the same time, some of the impediments to accessing reasonable services is that we criminalize the user who's suffering from mental health and addiction challenges, a medical problem. And we've heard about the consequences of criminalizing that. And yet we are incapable, and this is not to say anything about the police and our judicial setting. This is such a huge problem. Small amounts, easily transported, changing all the time, hard to detect, very potent, can make it, synthesize it anywhere. Like that would be our law enforcement agency's worst nightmare. And I personally don't think they are able, despite all their best efforts, to criminalize a solution out of this. And so I would have to wonder whether we have to rethink health policy at a national level and begin a discussion about should we be criminalizing and making those people suffer who are the users, who actually have underlying mental health and addictions problems, when in fact we should be getting after the people who are supplying the drugs.
Thank you.
People know a lot more about this, and I hope I've represented some of our views, colleagues.
Maybe two very small comments about this. Like, for sure, criminalization is not the option, and it actually impairs them accessing care because they are afraid that by going, seeing a physician and telling them that they are abusing illegal substances, that the doctor will, call the police. And of course, we have a duty of confidentiality, and we won't do this, but it's a fear that they have, so we need to remove that first barrier. And the second thing is, I'm going through training right now in medical school, and I have colleagues who are residents in family practice, and they are going to be the ones who are going to be frontline with indigenous communities or more socially deprived population. And I think the training we get during medical school or residency about substance abuse in general, how to treat substance abuse, the risk factor that leads to addiction is just awful or non-existent. So I think this is something that needs to be addressed by maybe the Royal College of Physicians or even Health Canada or something to incorporate some sensitivity and some medical capabilities for all physicians in Canada. And this must be a duty of care to provide treatment for substance abuse. It's not just an option for physicians to choose to treat that kind of population. It should be a duty, I think.
Anybody? Go ahead.
I just want to underscore something that John said earlier, and I applaud him for making this point, that we focus, I think rightly, a lot of attention on trying to help people who are suffering from mental health and addiction problems to access treatment. And that's critically important, and I work within that system, and I'm not going to downplay the importance of that. However, there is a significant number of people currently suffering who cannot or will not stop using. We need to provide services and resources for those people. We absolutely must. If we do not provide services and resources for people who cannot stop using for reasons of extreme trauma, the substance is the only thing that keeps the trauma from overwhelming them. If we don't provide those services, then we are saying that they're not worth helping, and we're essentially signing a death warrant.
Can I just add that a few moments ago I lauded the Correctional Service of Canada, and rightly so. Having worked as a clinician in a medium security federal institution in Alberta, it was my experience as a mental health provider that it's probably one of the most challenging clinical environments. I almost put in air quotes, clinical environments, because of the nature and dynamics of the population. You have a very high, as I alluded to, a very, very high base rate of substance misuse. I dare say probably one of the most problematic segments of Canadian population or population anywhere, because this is not unique to Canada. But if you think about it, so you put in the same enclosed environment for an extended period of time, a group of people who are they're challenged in the most serious kind of way with their use of drugs and alcohol, in combination with all of the people who make it their business to sell drugs and related, and not necessarily, especially at the federal level in Canada, not necessarily like the street level. You got right up to very, very high level organized crime and so on. So you put all those people together, you haven't got the hermetically sealed dome like Springfield has, and they've got all kinds of time on their hands, and guess what happens? And you're trying to do positive things for the person, as we're trained as mental health and addictions professionals, in a way that's also going to be serve the public good in terms of reducing the individual's risk once they are released. And I think we probably all know the overwhelming majority of individuals incarcerated in Canada are eventually released and so on. How do you want them coming back to Canadian communities? It's that kind of environment that you have to understand the day-to-day reality that these individuals are facing when you put these groups of individuals together with time, by virtue, by definition, time on their hands.
Okay. Senator Boniface?
Yes, thank you all. I could talk about this for hours. For those who aren't familiar with me, my background's policing. So I have been talking a lot to the policing community about the impact for them on calls for service. I'm from Aurelia, so familiar with Penetang and so using as an example my community. So it's more of a statement than I think it shows a gap. In my community, 30,000 people, 45 to 50 people at any given time homeless. And if you narrow that down to the people who are homeless, the calls for service are probably about, and I could be slightly off here, 65 to 70% of the calls for service are around this issue. So my son, who works in the community as a community officer trying to deal with this issue, would say that if there were community resources available that could support the police, you could take the criminalization process out, like Dr. Turnbull's doing, and actually give people housing, give them the community support they need. Then your law enforcement isn't coming to do, in a community of 30,000, a call a day, every shift on overdoses. This is a huge increase in a rural community. And now it's spreading because as soon as you start getting people who are so hooked, then you get into other crimes that are derivatives of it in order to get money to be able to do it, and the rip-offs start and away you go. I don't have confidence that we will see leadership in government at any level on this. We just did a 6-part, I don't know, Dr. Wells, if you saw it in our local paper, a 6-part thing on the opioid crisis in our area. And people were still arguing that the police just need to enforce more. And so for me, I think it's programs like Dr. Turnbull's doing, the work that all of you are doing, and some of the grassroots work that, like the police are doing after the Glasgow model, trying to address what the root causes are. So, I mean, we've heard, a consistent message this morning, we need to deal with the root causes, and I think that somehow we have to move forward on a drug policy and influence people who can make the decision. But I'm worried, as Dr. Turnbull said, that we will be into a crisis we don't even understand within such a short period of time, because we continue to deny that the root causes are part of the issue here.
Any comments?
If I may, I'd be interested to know what my other colleagues have to say, but I've worked with thousands of individuals with substance use issues, either directly or indirectly. I've never met anyone who this is what they wanted in life. This is what it's a monkey on their back, and they can't get rid of it. They've been doing it so long, it's changed their physiology. They can't live without it, or it's extremely difficult to, so they don't stop. But I never met anybody, regardless of their situation, whether it was incarcerated or not, where this was what their life plan involved.
I could just relate a conversation I had a short time ago with somebody who an injection drug user, opioids, brought into a program replacing the toxic drug supply with prescription injectable opioids. She asked for an increase in her dose, and I said, you just can't keep increasing your dose just to get high. And she said, high? You just don't understand, do you? And it was true, exactly true. I did not understand. She said, we do this to get numb, not to get high. The only time that I can feel normal is when I'm on drugs. Otherwise, if I'm off drugs or have to be abstinent, I have to be the person that I was, and I hate that person. So until you can change that person, I'm going to still use drugs. And I want to get numb from the person that I was. And it's when we start to understand that, all the factors that led them to be that person, that's when we'll be successful.
I'm going to go to the audience, and we'll take 2 questioners from the audience, and then we'll go back to senators. First one, and the microphone is just at the front, Billy Joe Bogdan, and following Billy Joe Bogdan is Jordan McLean.
Hi, thank you for having this meeting today and for making it open to the public. I am a patient, and I was released from hospital yesterday afternoon. And I actually saw the invite yesterday afternoon sitting on my hospital bed. And I said, I have to get out of here. I have to go. And I'm glad I came, because I didn't hear anything about patients like me here today. I have been using opioids successfully for over 12 years. Opioids, when I needed them, saved my life. After a doctor misdiagnosed a very critical illness that lasted 7 years and gave me multiple sclerosis. So I was, after my surgery, titrated down from 300 micrograms of fentanyl patch. I left the hospital on a 25 microgram patch. So I know about titration as well, and how it's done in our hospital system, and the stigma that comes along with it. The problem is we don't have anybody representing patients here today, because there are legitimate patients. And the interesting thing is I'm a former public servant who started my career at Health Canada. And the only reason I have not been able to return to work is because I'm waiting for a surgery. And I have been waiting 9 years. And now it's gotten so bad that I've had 4 hospital visits in the past 2 months. So ask me about how we're spending our healthcare dollars and how we can improve with prevention. Yes, I had to take a lot of opioids, but it was only to survive. A lot of people who take them don't want to take them, but they want to participate in their life. So if I could bring any message here today, it's that the answer has to be made in concert with patients, because they're the ones who are making the sacrifice. I've heard a lot of people here talk about people who have addictions. Let's talk about the people who've been on high-dose opioids and are currently being titrated by their doctor. Nobody is helping them. There are no community services. Talk about going off the rails. You can't tell your doctor. You can't tell your wife. You can't tell your employer. So who do you go see? Your friend who has a friend who has a friend. It is no secret what is causing the opioid crisis. And kudos to the Ottawa Police. Oh, I was just going to say, they've agreed to work with us and patients to find real, tangible solutions to catch it before it presents itself on your front door. So I would just encourage you to consider perhaps a patient presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
No, thank you very much for your. No, I was going to thank you so much for this statement, and I think it's something we're going to bring back and certainly consider next time we organize an open caucus. So thank you so much for exposing
Appreciate
that
it.
challenge.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jordan McLean.
Thank you for having us. I'm not I'm a former drug user myself. I've highly addicted for 20 years, and I'm back to school to be a social worker. I work in the injection room at Somerset West. We've been inundated with people. We have a small waiting room that's we're going to need about 10 waiting rooms the next couple of months. We need to be open 24 hours a day. Like Mr. Turnbull said, it's only one step, but it's a needed step. And we have a whole bunch of professionals here, but like the woman that just spoke, I was part of a group called CSCS since 2014. We've been screaming on Parliament Hill that we need a safe injection site. They said it'll never happen. You need to listen to the grassroots people as well, because of course, we opened 3 or 4 now. We lose people every day, and we don't have the real professionals, which are the people that are actively using here. And how do you make a decision for someone if you haven't been in their shoes? I wasn't born to be a drug addict. When I was 15, recreationally using drugs, 20 years later, I'm like, what the hell happened? It's what happened and how did 20 years go by? I need help now. There's not enough help. When you want help, you have to wait on a waiting list. You have to go through a whole bunch of steps. By that time, you could have died. You change your mind. There's so much stigma against you. I remember I was in the hospital once when I was like 21 years old from a car accident. They found out that I was a drug addict, and they handcuffed me to the bed. For what? Because I reported that I was, actively using drugs, and, it was just the stigma is incredible. It's still out there. So we need to learn from the people who are actively using in these kind of things, because you can't make a decision for someone if you don't, if you haven't been there. It's very difficult, and we appreciate, but I mean, if you don't, the hierarchy of needs, Maslow's, if you don't address their housing and certain things, and if you don't, personally touch them, they're not going to want to change. Honestly, it's going to be hard to hear, but some people on the streets actually tell me that this epidemic is because the government wants to keep the population down. That's what people actually think on the street, because they don't trust the government, because the government doesn't put enough money into the things. I heard that. I was like, come on, you really think that? I've heard from more than one person. I mean, how could someone think that of the government? Well, that's what the truth is. Some people actually think that, that's just absurd. We live in Canada, for God's sakes, If we're a multicultural place and we care about other, why aren't we giving the people on the streets? Why aren't we taking care of them? I just don't understand it, and this is a great start, but you're right. I mean, we take all this time to make decisions when people are dying every day. I mean, I've lost so many people in the last couple of years. I've got PTSD probably from working in that room, seeing those things you see. We don't have support for frontline workers. I can go on and on and on. It's just, we just need more money. That's what it is. We need to care more. And, and have people that are actively going through this and ask their opinion and what they need, because you're not going to figure it out. It's just going to become, what is our afternoon epidemic? I don't know what it's called, but it's coming. So appreciate the time.
Thank you very much, and it's always very powerful when somebody who has lived it presents to us. So thank you very much. We're going to go back to the senators list now. Senator Bovey.
Thank you. I have to say, in many ways, words fail, and I want to thank you very much, both of you, for your interventions. I couldn't agree more about the need for patient-centered health decisions, and I'm aware of a couple of, shall we say, new studies that are being done in various parts of the country, and I applaud you, and please keep that message going. I'm going to be very personal, if I may. I'm one who lost a stepson to, do I say a modified opioid? I don't know what the terminology is. I hadn't known him for very long, but I can tell you the impact on the family was huge. And I think this is a problem with multi-root causes, multi-dimensions. I certainly agree that the social determinants of health and poverty is one. But, you know, I don't think it's the only one. And until we address or try to peel the layers of the onion away, if I may use that terminology, to see the various layers of these causes. This stepson was a very successful young lawyer. So I guess my question is the NIMBY question, not in my own backyard. And I'm from Winnipeg. I'm a Winnipeg senator. And we've got a couple of things going on in Winnipeg. You all know about the street issues and the Indigenous populations in downtown Winnipeg. So I want to talk about two things, if I may, and ask your questions on two things. We have the Main Street Project, which I know you're well aware of, which has just had an infusion of money. We have a problem, I think, in Winnipeg, though, of safe injection sites. Province and city won't fund them, and I think it's been proven how important they are. I worked with the Woodstock situation in another part of my life, so my question is I appreciate it's a stopgap measure, but how do we parlay short-term help measures into long-term effects? We also have the case of Scott Oak and his family wanting to develop the Bruce Oak Center in St. James, which is not one of the poverty-stricken parts of the city. To huge community debate with people saying, I don't want it in my region. And I think until we understand that this crisis affects people of all socioeconomic situations for all sorts of reasons, some of issues of social determinants, others of issues, as we've heard, of shall we say, medical history, and how do we go about that? What is it that we need to do in public policy to, I don't know whether you ever erase stigmas, but maybe how do we turn public understanding so the fear for treating or helping people in need for whatever reason, how do we turn that? What do we do as members of the Senate of Canada with very real concerns about this emergency epidemic? What can we do to change some of the discussion, add patient-centered health care? Would guaranteed minimum income help some of the poverty questions? This is something I've been calling for a long time, and we know about the Manitoba experiment up in Dauphin those years ago. How do we pull all this together? What's your recommendation, all your recommendations for us on a front line?
Would like to tackle the question.
By being pragmatic and by being bold. I think once people see that this works, it will begin to change attitude and perception. Once you see that the supervised injection site, it doesn't condone drug use. It doesn't foster the honeypot effect that sounds like should be out of Winnie the Pooh, but the idea being if you create a center or a location like that, all of the dealers are going to swarm around. The research in Canada, in Australia, where it was done very early on, it's all very clear. That's a fallacy. It's a myth. It just doesn't happen. So a lot of the NIMBY business and so on is just not founded in reality. When I mean, Jeff is much better than I in terms of being able to really speak to this, but just do it. That's the Nike symbol.
I think a very cynical answer to that could also be just like money. Just we have to show people that all those interventions are like cost effective, and by putting people back on the work market and have stable life and stable families, they will pay taxes, have better health outcomes, cost less to the province in terms of like disengorging emergency rooms and everything. So I think
You mentioned the issue of stigma, and as a root cause of continuing problems, I think stigma is a big one. And I don't have the solution conveniently at hand, but I know that we have to stop an us and them presentation of problems. I see us in all of them, and I see them in all of us. People who are street involved were us. They continue to be us. And how can we foster that inclusivity that Canada is notorious for? How can we foster that inclusivity for our own people, and recognizing that there's a spectrum of problems, from the most serious and critical and severe on one end of the spectrum to people who are not addicted. The vast majority of people who use drugs are not addicted. A small minority are, but there are a whole lot of people who use drugs who need supports, as clearly was demonstrated today from our audience. So there's a spectrum of responses needed as well. And I think that we focus on the low-hanging fruit. We focus on law enforcement, that they're supposed to solve everything. And our law enforcement are telling us that they cannot arrest us out of this problem. We focus on solutions that can be contained and seem to be successful within 4 years, because that's a political term. And maybe that's where the Senate's most critical role can be, is to hold on to this discussion and hold on to the issue beyond the 4 years of whatever current political regime, and keep the focus and celebrate the successes that we are having. I don't think our communities are hearing that we are having successes. And certainly the Main Street Project and some of their innovative work is a fantastic example of that. And just as a plug for anybody here who might have connections in Manitoba, there is an appeal hearing of the Bruce Oak Recovery Center tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. 175 people have signed a petition arguing against having that facility in a nice neighborhood. And you can send in, rather than being there in person, you can send in an email response indicating your support for that recovery program.
Can I just comment on one thing? It goes to the very essence of the conversation, I think, and the solutions and what the government can do arises from it. And what we have normally done with people who are vulnerable, not sort of, my guys, not sort of agreeable to the usual population, we isolate them. We put them in a small area. It's Lower Town for me. It's the Lower East Side. It's St. Jamestown. It's an Indigenous community. We isolate them, and we deprive them of access to reasonable services that would be designed to address their problems. We expose them to greater risk. In an incarcerated setting, there's more trauma, the people there. For me, violence is a usual part of everyday life. So we put them at a greater risk. We take away services from them, and then we're surprised that they have such terrible outcomes. We don't think that these are members of our community. Fundamentally, this is not my problem. It's theirs. They made a decision to become homeless, addicted, with mental health challenges. The solution is theirs. I don't have to get involved. because they're not my community. Until you can actually say, no, we're all part of that community. These are your people. They can be your son, your daughter, your parent. As the reality is, that's the case. And until you do that, you're still going to have NIMBYism. You're still going to have stigma. And you'll be isolating these people forever. And so I think, to your question, is we have to address that fundamental question is, who are these people? And I would argue that they're my neighbors. And they deserve all of the entitlements that I get.
Yeah, I think all this conversation basically comes down to like public health intervention. You know, there are like three basic level, like primary, secondary, tertiary, and I think different population requires different measure. One thing that has not been raised today, but I think it's important, is that the criminal fight against opioid is a criminal jurisdiction with the criminal law and like Health Canada regulating drugs and everything. But public health is a provincial problem, and those two are not talking to each other, or very little. And I think this prevents an effective response against the opioid crisis. I think we need to target an effective intervention and have people talk with each other.
Very good point about the jurisdictional matters. Let's just get it done. We're going to hear from two more members of our audience, David Vance, followed by Spencer Mel, I think. David?
Good day. How are you today? My name's David, and I work at one of the safe consumption sites. And I've noticed that we don't seem to be able to arrest our way out of this. And whatever we're doing now seems very, very ineffective. I'm an ex-user myself. I've been 8 years off of heroin, and it was heroin when I was using. But I've come to the realization, when you take any substance and you make it illegal, you've just opened the books for every cartel and every criminal organization to make money off of it. I've also come to the understanding that addiction is a cycle. So we have to find a way to change that cycle or to alter it. Because when you alter somebody's cycle, you fundamentally change it. So what we need to do is to find a way to change people's cycles. I've had thoughts, and a few of my friends have had thoughts, that the only way we're going to do this is to actually legalize the drugs. Give people what they want on a daily basis. That way, you're going to reduce crime, they're going to empty the jails, and people are going to get bored of using eventually. The way it is now, we're on a slippery slope, and the way that things are going, I see no way out of it. It's only going to get a lot worse. Because as somebody said earlier, as people try to change the laws to catch these drugs and the criminals that are providing them, they just tweak it a little bit, and it's different. So we have to take a look at what exactly it is we're doing and how we're doing it. And there's so many people that are going to die if we don't do it quicker than what we're doing. Sitting here and talking is great. It brings awareness. But until we actually all get included in the conversation, until we can find a viable way to do it, we're going to be looking at a lot more deaths. And the situation is going to get a lot worse.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Go ahead.
Wanted to speak to a couple of things, and thank you very much, David, for that comment. I think that he's absolutely right about the legalization of drugs. I think that Portugal has a very good model in terms of legalizing opioids and supporting the use of it in a supportive environment. I think one of the very good examples is the Crosstown Clinic in downtown Eastside Vancouver, where they have clean heroin and clean dilaudid, which patients come in and they observe their use. I was able to visit there and visited a lot of places because we're looking for answers on our reserve. And I think that part of that would be taking out the criminal element by offering clean and supportive care with heroin or dilaudid in a clinic where it can be done. And the patients that I saw at that clinic, many of them were part of the criminal element, but were able to finally get a home, like an apartment. We're able to help other people wanting to get out of the cycles that they wanted to get into. And I think it was a very good experiment. I think that we should be looking at supporting those kind of projects. And the other thing too is because our community is basically a small community, we can move faster in terms of the things that we want to do. Canada is a huge nation and it moves very, very slow in terms of instituting projects and programs and policy. What we have done on the reserve is we've talked about a continuum of care for people that have addictions and mental health issues. And so what we've done is one project at a time to build a continuum of care for people who have a medical illness. And in other places, it needs to be seen as a medical illness, and that we need to build support systems for them that at some point hopefully are seamless, so they can move from where they're at to being supported to a long-term treatment solution. So I think we have to look at a continuum of care for those people that we need to help.
Thank you very much for that. Spencer?
Yes. Spencer Kell, crystal meth addict, heroin junkie, provincial inmate number 100078283, ACSW student at Willis College, manager of Dunn's famous restaurant here in the Byward Market. And what I wanted to comment on was Mr. Weeks had a good display of hands and an interactive experiment with the audience and with the Senate members about breaking habits, which I thought was interesting, and everybody participated. And then followed with the question that if we're unable to break these types of habits, what makes anybody think that somebody who uses drugs on a daily basis be able to break that habit themselves, right? And so you said that that it's something that they can't do. And I think that's the question that we need to address is, why can't they do it? Maybe we can do another interactive display and say, anybody who has ever had an encounter with alcohol in their life, could they please raise their hand? Okay, now does anybody with your hand still raised, how many people have a problematic relationship with alcohol? Okay, so I would say a lot of hands went down. I still see 3 raised. So I think that would be evidence to the fact that substance is not the problem. And the problem is, so the people in this room, aside from us 3 former addicts who had their hands raised, the problem in the room, or the problem is not the substance, right? The problem is the individual. And there's something going on with that individual. Now, with regards to the Indigenous people, why do we think there's such an overrepresentation of the Indigenous people in our prison systems and in our addicted community? When I stood up here first, I gave you 4 different identities that I have, right? The Indigenous people have been stripped of their identity from when we started putting them on the reservations. So it's no wonder there's an overrepresentation of Indigenous people among addicted communities and in our jail systems. For me, myself, was able to change my identity. My former identity was speedballer, heroin junkie, criminal. Now I'm a graduate from ACSW at Willis College. I'm a manager of a restaurant downtown. So I've completely changed my identity. I have a new identity that I'm happy about. So we come back to the question from Mr. Weeks, or the question I have for Mr. Weeks is, why can't we change this? Why can't we change the fact that people can't stop? That's the issue that needs to be addressed. So it's interesting we bring up the criminal justice system. So currently, I believe our government is spending about $47 billion to keep people incarcerated across our country per year. We're using $26.3 million to throw at the problem of addiction. It just seems to be that the scale is a little offset there. Your studies showed that 7, maybe 8 out of 10 people who are incarcerated have some sort of substance abuse issue or mental health, right? So on any given day in our country, you can find about 117,000 people incarcerated. If 80% of those people are dealing with mental health and addiction issues, then we're looking at about, 190 to 100,000 of those people a day, at a cost of $313 per head to our Canadian taxpayer to keep them incarcerated there. These people, why can't they stop using? Because they don't have an identity. That is their identity. It doesn't, everybody here that doesn't have an issue with alcohol, the reason why you don't have a problematic relationship with alcohol is you have an identity. You're so-and-so from this, you're so-and-so from that. You know, everybody has some place that they fit into our community, they're connected into our community. So in my mind, the problem with this addiction, it lies with disconnection from our communities. So what are we doing about social programming? So you have a guy sitting in jail who used to be a mechanic, who had problems in his life and became addicted to drugs. He still has potential to be that mechanic. But instead, his new identity is he's a drug addict, and that's what he continues to be. So we don't have viable treatment options available to inmates who are incarcerated. We know that when inmates come into an incarceration setting, they cease the use of drugs. Then when they leave there within hours or the first day, a lot of them will die. So when an inmate becomes incarcerated, I think that we're presented with a very unique opportunity that inmate, for the most part, ceases the use of drugs, starts to regain their identity, realizes that they're in an environment that is distasteful to them, that they would rather be somewhere else. And so what do? We let them serve their sentence. 76% of the inmates will be released within 1 month of incarceration on a time-served plea. The next 50% will be released under 6 months on a time-served plea. And where do they go? They have 6 months they've been dried out, and they go right back to the dealer's house. Why do they go right back to the dealer's house? Because they don't know any other place to go. And why do they die? Because we have these crazy substances that are uncontrolled. So in my mind, we're looking at 2 different problems here that we're discussing, and there's a bit of an overlap. One is the harm reduction model with the issues, we have these crazy drugs and that, and it's killing people. So what do we do immediately to stop that? We have some good harm reduction models because these substances are killing people. But how do we get people to stop going to these substances? And how do we get people to become reconnected into society is a completely different problem. And that lies with the treatment. That lies with treatment options available. So again, with $26.3 million available federally for to throw at the problem of addiction, and that's not just the people that are incarcerated. That's for everybody. But we're going to spend $47 billion to keep guys in jail at $313 a day. So why don't we shift some of the funding here and see, one of the other things we didn't mention in that study with the people that are incarcerated is that 7 out of 10 females and 8 out of 10 males will return back into custody once released. So we have a recidivism rate of 70% among females and 80% among males. So they're going to continue to come back in that system. And I know that system, a revolving door. I'll go in for a month, 2 months, 3 months, dry out, get out, intend to change my life, have zero access to services and social programming, and end up committing a crime, regain my identity as a low-life type of person, and back into the system. For me, it was 20 years of doing that. So I guess what I'd like to put forward is why is there such a misappropriation of funds, and should we maybe be doing some thinking about what treatment options might be available to people, and maybe more treatment options to go outside of the spectrum of simply treating addiction, but it's a spiritual wholeness, or a complete wholeness of physical health, mental health, spiritual health, emotional health, and financial health that needs to happen. And that's what everybody in this room whose hands went down with the alcohol experiment has. That's what nobody who's using the safe injection site has. So what can we do as a country to make that available to people who otherwise don't have an identity? And I find it curious too that, you know, I believe I was in grade 3 when they removed the Lord's Prayer from our school, like when we used to stand up and sing the national anthem and then say the Lord's Prayer. And I'd be interested to see the studies that show the increase of...
Sorry, we've got the room until 10 o'clock and it's almost 10:15, so I wonder if you could just finish up in another half a minute.
I was just curious to wonder what the stats would be on when we kicked God out of school and let the devil in, how much different that might be. Anyway, that's it.
Thank you very much for what was actually a presentation. And it's really important when we hear these things, as we've heard from the audience members, people who have taken part, who have lived what your stories are just incredible, like to hear how you've been impacted. And to all of you who spoke, the tremendous job that you have done in finding yourselves and finding your identity, I think, which is what you so eloquently put. So thank you so much to the panelists. You have been incredible. Thank you very much to audience members for coming, particularly those who had the courage to stand at the microphone and tell their stories. It's been a great morning. Thank you very much.